Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Sociology of Media Voices series. Today, we have the privilege of speaking to Richard James Allen, and he is a contemporary Australian poet, dancer, actor, and filmmaker. He is the former artistic director of the Poets Union Incorporated and founding director of the Australian Poetry Festival. Allen was co-artistic director with Karen Pillman of That Was Fast and TASA Dance, and now as the physical TV company. Allen has published well over 12 books of poetry, fiction, and performance texts, most recently More Lies, which you're going to be discussing today. And just to give you a little bit of a synopsis before we speak to him, More Lies is a highly referential comedy thriller about a writer being held hostage in their own apartment and forced to type to hide the maneuvers of a female fatale holding a pearl-handed gun and her brother, a small-time thug with big-time ambitions. The wild tale about assassination, lost gold, betrayal, passion, and identity, theft engages the reader in many layers of the author's witty but deceptive journey. Through a series of lies, backflips, and alternative versions of the tale, the author moves from being a trapped hack forced to prostitute themselves to dazzling the world with the acrobatics of their imagination. To the heart of the matter, storytelling is all that is keeping them alive. What a fascinating introduction, and let's welcome Dr. Richard James Allen. So without any further ado, here is Richard James Allen. Welcome, Richard, to the Sociology of Media.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here, Ricky. Thanks so much for having me.
Lovely. So before we delve right into More Lies, let's talk a little bit about yourself. What is the Richard James Allen story?
Oh my God, the Richard James Allen story. Well, it's very long and complicated, so I guess you'd have to sort of pin that down a bit. But I would say that my story is definitely animated by the desire to be creative, to find ways to be creative, and to follow ideas where they need to go. So the sort of sense that an idea might manifest as a novel or a poetry book or a film or a dance, to sort of not get stuck in it, to try to get very technically good at each of the forms I work in, but also to let an idea have its head in terms of where it needs to manifest.
And when was the first time in your life when you either picked up a book or should more specifically, you picked up a pen and thought, I'm going to write something?
Yeah, well, look, great question. I came from a family that loved books. Our family, I have everyone was a big reader, and both my brothers had PhDs before I had a PhD. And my mother was a journalist, and my father became a novelist as well. So we had books everywhere, and the bookshelves everywhere. So I was surrounded by books, and so I guess, I started reading really early. I think for writing for me, it started out I started writing a diary when I was about 10 or something like that. And I'd grown up in Asia. So I spent my first 4 years in Vietnam and my next 6.5 in Japan. And when I came back to Australia, that was kind of when I started writing, because I started writing a diary, and I wrote a diary for about 4 years. And then I found that I was just not that interested in recording the actual events of the day. I was interested in recording my feelings about them and the colors and textures, and, not like I did this, but, that sunset or that flower, what I don't know what it was, but whatever, the descriptions of things and people. So gradually that diary just sort of morphed into a notebook, and that morphed into creative writing.
Incredible. And I have to ask you on this point, have you actually kept that original source?
Yes, yes, I still have those original diaries, which I think by the time I was, as I recall, I sort of did that for about 3 or 4 years. And by the time I was 14, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I was like,
Oh,
I just knew that was something that I was going to do and be, or try to do and be. So yeah, I wanted to be a writer. So
wonderful. And what about growing up? Was there any particular writer that really kind of captivated you? Like you loved the way they put words together and you
well,
thought, I
you
want to be
know,
like them.
I love the sound of words. And one of the things that I found was actually had, interestingly, when I first started to read, it was very hard for me to read. So I had a lot of, I don't know, I was dyslexic. It was way
Oh,
before anyone even talked about those things. But I remember having a massive struggle learning to read. And I was trying to read, there's kids' books, and there was a huge challenge to actually get through a
mm,
page. And the day that I got through a page was a huge victory. And then I was sort of able to flow on. But and so I still do love to read, but actually I love to listen. And so to me, listening to text is actually more pleasurable than reading, though obviously I can read now. So I used to go when we lived at Avalon, and I used to go to the Monavale Library and take out all the uh, books on tape and records and all the different formats they had, and I used to listen to poetry and plays
mm.
and novels. And I remember absolutely falling in love with Sir Ralph Richardson reading Keats, and to me
Ah,
that was like the perfect music. And so I think that created, it's a very traditional sort of thing to fall in love with, but I think that really created a bedrock for me of the musicality, the possible musicality of language.
interesting. And you mentioned, which is one of the main things that, of many things you're known for, is obviously your wonderful poetry. How does that, what does that reveal about yourself when you're writing poetry? How much of that is consciously you in your work as opposed to unconsciously coming through in your work?
Oh, it's so interesting. Look, I don't think I really write confessional writing, but I feel like I have lived every line that I've written, which is
Mm,
not to say that every line is strictly speaking autobiographical, because that wouldn't be correct. But I think emotionally, um, you know, I've understood on some level, or experienced on some level. I mean, there's a lot of words there, so that's a big generalization. But generally speaking, I guess in a broad way, without tying myself down too much, is that possible? I would say that, yeah, I think that every line has to be sort of genuine on some level. But at the same time, I love to create an artifact. So, More Lies is an artifact. It's a book of continual stories. I haven't done those things that are in that book. Well, maybe I have, but it's like but it's sort of like the play of language itself, and also the working with the craft of language, the way words can be like paint or like music. I love that too. And there's a sort of the working with that. So it isn't, yeah, it's complicated. It's complicated. I think I'd say that I try to make sure that there's truth behind every line, but I'm
and
also,
when you read or go back reading on any of your work do you feel that you have that same experience emotionally when you first had written that piece, or has that changed every time you reread a piece that you've written?
um, it's interesting. I know some writers go back and rewrite things. I look back at some of the work, say in my first poetry book, and occasionally I might go, oh, I would snip this out or whatever. And occasionally I have if I've republished, but generally I don't rewrite things from earlier eras, because I feel like you change as a person. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
you evolve. And so bringing the kind of sensibilities of one era of your life to another is liable to sort of erase a layer. But I'll tell you what's really, having said that, and I generally have very much have stuck by that. except, like occasionally I took something out of an early poem. But what's interesting about More Lies is that it's sort of gone through another process, because with More Lies, I wrote a lot of it when I was younger, but I've been editing it as I've got older. So I feel like
Oh.
it has a kind of double perspective within it. It has that kind of wild, crazy freedom of youth, but also it's very crafted with, the playful but technical considerations that come from age.
Oh, I just think age is wonderful. It allows us to really explore different ways of seeing things, and
Yeah.
it gives us the freedom to say what we perhaps wanted to say. And that sort of leads me to one thing before we go on and really unpack More Lies. I'm just curious that with your going on and doing your PhD, did you feel in any way that process of having to complete the PhD, had it at all stifled any of your creative processes that you relied on previously?
Look, my PhD was interesting. It was a doctorate of creative arts, and it was very challenging. I'm not going to say it wasn't challenging. I had worked incredibly hard on my undergraduate, but it had killed me, and I sort of didn't pick up an academic type book for many years. But when I went, there was quite a hiatus between my undergraduate and my PhD. But when I came back to my PhD, it was at a very interesting time. And I remember being advised about this, that it was the chance to sort of in mid-career, shall we say, take a step back and look at what you've done and think about where you're at and where you want to go. And I would say that overall, that was an incredibly fruitful experience. I had a wonderful supervisor, Martin Harrison, and also assistant supervisor, Ross Gibson. Martin's passed now, unfortunately, but he was a wonderful poet, wonderful man, and very tough, because he was like, this is a doctorate of creative arts, but it has to be as good as, any other doctorate. This is not a soft option. But I think I found it, in the end, even though it was very challenging, I wouldn't say it's easy. I'd say that I found it very, very fruitful. Also, I was doing a kind of a multiple creative thing, because I published an earlier work of fiction/poetry called The Kamikaze Mind was part of it. Or I wrote it and was published a bit later by Brandon Schlesinger. I also included in it the poetry book, which is actually crosses many forms, Thursday's Fictions. And there was 2 films, Rubber Man Accepts the Nobel Prize and No Surrender, and an anthology of writing for performance. So it had a lot of creativity involved, and it also had a dissertation, which was a very, very deep dive into all the influences that I had, but I hadn't really thought through, or hadn't read, or to trace down to their sources. So I would say that it was very, very fruitful, and it facilitated and enhanced and took my creative writing to another level.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it was hard work.
Yeah, I can imagine. And just going on from that, you were in a position where you were actually teaching at university level. What was that like?
Teaching. Look, I mean, teaching is a great sort of privilege, really. I think what comes from teaching is a huge amount of learning, because when you have to articulate your ideas, a bit like the doctorate, you have to kind of you can't just go, well, I sort of like this. You have to sort of trace them down and articulate them and bring them to a really clear level. So I think in general, I learned heaps from teaching, and actually was very inspired by it on multiple levels. Obviously, it's another way as well for creative artists to make some money, because you don't make lots of money from your creative artwork, sadly. Not yet, anyway.
I was just also interested in the argument, can one learn to be a poet, the craft of poetry, or do you think it's something that comes from within and is somehow nurtured through the process?
That's a really good question. Yeah. I mean, part of me would say I think that poets are born, because I think that it's a whole cluster of sensibilities and ways of perceiving and interacting with the world. Um, but I do think that uh, those impulses and those potentials can be assisted and trained and encouraged, and learn to sort of uh, to fulfill what they are, and to be able to be critical of that in a positive way. So
Mm,
I think, I have a whole workshop that I teach, which is all about trying to bring out each person's individual, what I call abiding concerns, what it is that their personality and their life and their karma and all whatever it is that's built them to this point, um, what it is that they're really working with as artists. And then I try to encourage them to go from there. So to me, it's not so much about, here's the way you write poetry and these are the rules, or here's the way you write novels and these are the rules, but more about what is it that your individual, what is the quality, nature, timbre, frame, structure, scope, potential of your individual voice,
mm,
and how can I as a teacher assist you hear that, work with that, refine that. So
mm,
in a way, it's bringing out the potential that I think people have underneath. And I do think anyone can learn to be a better writer, but I don't know, it's a hard question, but
mm.
that's kind of what I would say. So I'd say that people who are drawn to writing, for me, it's about helping them find out why and what they have to offer. Yeah.
And I guess for me, it's a way of being one's authentic self.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
journey, you can't hide. Although some people say, "Oh, I like to hide in my work," or "I like to," and I always think to myself, "Really? Do you really think it, or is it really masking what the truths that you don't, maybe consciously or subconsciously, as I mentioned before, coming to that surface through your work,
Yeah,
whether
look,
it be
I love that idea. And I think that, in lots of ways, I'm a very private person. And I don't, as I say, I don't really write autobiographical stuff very often. Um, but there's a lot of honesty in there's a lot of honesty in my work. And in a way, the, you know, I feel like I can take on a persona, or I can write something. And of course, that's incredibly revealing, but I don't think of it that way, because to me, I'm sort of in that other place, and that allows me the freedom to express those things without tying them right back to me. So it's sort of a double game. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
And now we come to my favorite bit where we actually start now exploring more lies.
Oh, great.
And let's go right into it. More lies. The title, let's start that. How did you come from that sort of that title?
Look, I
Because
often find that I get titles first, and the
ah,
titles, not always, but I quite often, for a major, bigger works, have titles first. Sometimes they even appear as lines in my poems, and I'm like, oh, that's an interesting title. It's sort of like they have the DNA of the idea in them. And literally, More Lies is the DNA of the book, because it's more lies. Every time you read a chapter, it's more lies. It's like what I told you before. Well, it was true. It's not entirely true, but there's this other aspect to it. And then it goes on again.
mm,
So it's this sort of very playful thing. So literally, More Lies is the DNA of the book. So it's kind of like it's the mission statement of the book. Yeah.
and
Go
and
on.
where did you begin? You mentioned earlier. So this is a work in progress that had
Oh my God,
culminated
this
over
went on for
time.
so long, for so long. I'm embarrassed to say, I'm seriously embarrassed to say how long it went on. Basically, I was living in New York, and a dancer and a poet, and
Wow.
living the lifestyle from day to day. It was a very, very heavy time in New York. I mean, that was the time. This is going to be really depressing. It shows how old I am. This is the sort of Reagan Bush years, when Ronald Reagan had sort of uh, let all the drug dealers out on the streets, and they'd open up the They had not, they defunded all the mental institutions.
I do
So
remember the time.
yes, it was a
Yes.
very kind of like, if you went from your home, your apartment to your studio, you would literally be stepping over 50 people asking you for money. And
Mm.
you have to sort of decide, all right, today I've got one, I have to figure the one person I can give some money to today, because I'm going to see 50 people who want some money. And then there was so much sort of drug dealing and violence. We were living in the East Village, and I saw someone executed.
Mm.
In the street just near our building. I came home one night after a late night event and got in about 3 o'clock in the morning. And then the next morning, the police knocked on my door and said, "Where were you at 3:05?" And I said, "Well, I got in at 3 because I noticed it was pretty late." And then this taxi driver had been shot outside our building at 3:05.
Oh.
And so it was a it was a it was a it was kind of like the prefiguring of the Trump era, frankly. It was like everything was just moral chaos.
Mm.
And I and then also we were deeply involved in the dance community.
Mm-hmm.
And that was when AIDS hit, and that was
Mm.
absolutely ravaging
Mm.
for our community, our friends. I knew many people who died and struggled. So it was a very, and it was very, very sad. So it was just a very intense sort of time. And I went out of the city for one of the first times. I was going off to a holiday on Cape Cod, and I just started writing this thing. I don't remember if it was the first time I'd gone, but I remember I started writing when I'd left the city, because it was sort of like, just gave me a bit of perspective. But ironically, I wrote it. You see, the book is dedicated for money, because I was like, oh, I'm going to spend the summer writing a page-turning bestseller, and this is going to fund all my crazy projects. And that didn't quite work out that way. Years and years and years later, it's finally published. We'll see what happens. But yeah, so I sort of started then. Though actually, I also realized when I was doing the acknowledgements that some of the very first texts for this were published when I was at Sydney University years and years ago. One even was one university writing competition called Story Story. That's one of the chapters. It's called Story Story. And sorry, I just so yeah, it actually has a very, 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 very deep roots. And then kept evolving and evolving, because I'd sort of write it and then put it in the bottom drawer, and then I showed some people and got some advice, and that was really helpful, especially Polly Rowe, the dramaturg, literary manager at Sydney Theatre Company, because I was thinking about making a play, and she had some really great advice which sort of worked its way in. So it was a kind of very, very long process, starting from these very, very early roots. And then my partner Karen wrote a screenplay version and a play version, and we couldn't quite find a place to put them on and do them. And then I just started to feel like it was never going to go anywhere. But every time I looked at it, I was like, but I really like it. I mean, there's something here. It's worth it. Worth another go. Worth another. So I'd go back and I'd do a rewrite, and I'd go, oh yeah, and then I'd go. So it just went on for a long time. And then finally, interestingly, someone was talking to me about making low budget films, and I thought, well, maybe I could make it of this. And in the end, I don't know if we're going to do that, but I kind of took that opportunity to do another rewrite after I thought I'd done the last rewrite. And then I thought, okay, this is actually good now. This is actually okay now, many, 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 many years later. And that's the version we have. So it's been the longest running piece of writing of my entire life.
I'm going to ask you, I had this image of you kind of when you started. Did you do it first on a typewriter?
I did.
I knew it. I just had this image of you sitting there, having a drink in one hand and having the ocean or something near you, or waves or rain filtering down as you're beginning to type away, and all this sort of coming.
Totally. That's it.
It's wonderful. It's just a classic. I just have this. Oh, I mean, the lived experience you have has been a dream for many of us. Thinking about, oh, I'd love to go to New York, or, just be able just to put on a coat and walk down and just be able to have that experience. To be around creative people and just sit in a cafe and just pour out one's emotions, and here you are living that life in the 80s, and an incredible time, an
Yeah.
incredible creative, sad but very powerful, very rich
Oh,
time.
yeah. It was an amazing time. It was so full of conflict and creativity, and there were, extraordinary artists at that time working in dance and write poetry and performance art and
Mm.
film. And, the great thing about New York is you do get to meet a lot of those people. So I knew a lot of those people, and yeah, it was an amazing time to be there. I think, a lot of people, they say the best time in New York was the 30s or the 50s, or, each one has its own thing. But it was very dynamic era because there was a kind of bursting forth of creativity against
Mm.
a very conservative government and
Mm-hmm.
regime. And that often creates some some interesting dynamism. Yeah.
And let's now delve into more lies.
Yeah.
How the characters, how did you sort of develop those characters?
Well, interestingly, someone asked me the other day, and I said the characters sort of wrote themselves. I mean, I
Ah.
don't know if that's true, but they sort of did because they're kind of like, they're sort of like characters from the Maltese Falcon coming alive. Do you know what I mean? So it's
Mm-hmm.
sort of like they just walked in and just took over. So it, I mean, in the process of um, writing and rewriting, of course, I did various sort of things, but it's not like I just sort of sat down and did a whole, like, let's do a scaffolding for this character. It had a lot of just the energy of those people. It's funny because I often hear people say, oh, the characters took over. And I was like, what are you talking about? But when I think about it, that kind of happened here because they just they took on a life of their own.
And does it lead people like this journey about more lies? I can imagine you're toying with people because just as someone thinks they know what's going to happen,
Yes.
then all of a sudden it's like you wonder, did this really happen? Or am I being, because you want to know, what's next? And I'm wondering this journey, this process, was that a deliberate?
Yeah, well, as I said, it's in the DNA. It's very playful. It's playing, playfully, respectfully, disrespectfully sometimes with our need to know what's next and our desire for story
Mm,
and
mm,
our sort of willingness is, to the joy of the fiction is the suspension of disbelief. And I'm playing with that a bit, but also kind of, throwing it back a bit and going, well, yes, but you also have to kind of make some choices and judgments. You can't just believe everything you hear. And I think that's interesting because it's taken so long to come out. And one of the reasons I think it's interesting that it's finally come out now is that this is and I'm not saying it's a moral fable, but there is a level on which this is a great time for people to also take some responsibility about what they believe in, because so many people believe
mm.
in absolute rubbish that they, yeah, it sounds good. It's a great story and the storyteller's flamboyant and, you love them, but you've got to kind of take some responsibility yourself about that. So on a deeper level, or, I think that's one of the things going on there is it's this joy and playfulness and my joy and love of story and my, I love binge watching, late night TV as well as anyone else and just carrying on and what's next. But I think that, we also have to kind of center ourselves a bit and take our own responsibility for what we believe and think. So yeah, it's playing with all that stuff. It's playing with the form, and it shouldn't be taken too seriously. It's not. It's a bit of fun.
And I love that idea where you have that funness, because in a time where, having confronted with a lot of sadness around us with obviously with COVID and you know that rise in movement of disinformation and people kind of, you know, feeling their freedoms are being taken away, and all sorts of movements sort of rising, that through these small lies kind of really situates where we are at the moment in society, where we're kind of trying to recapture something, you know, of the past, hold on to some elements of the past. But yet what you're doing, I feel, through this narrative, this wonderful creation, is it's really challenging us to kind of almost build a resilience to kind of think, hang on a minute, just when you think you
That's
know
it.
what's going to happen.
You've got
No.
it. More lies is exposure therapy.
And that,
Exposure
exactly.
therapy.
I know, my darling. And that's why I love it. And, you know,
Great.
I'm just excited because I really hope we can put some sort of live production of this, because I think it's at the right time and the right place.
Yeah.
You know, when you say, what's the word, when all the planets align, that I think a lot of people will take something from this and really start to perhaps kind of resonate with them that, you know what, it's okay. It's okay when things don't happen a certain way. You're going to get through it, but you just go along with the journey. And that's what I feel as though this, what you've created here, it gives us that experience. You know, I almost feel as though I'm going on an unknown roller coaster, and I think I know what's going to happen. And as I do, my emotions go, and it's not where it's going to be. And that rush, or that disconnect, you know, and it does that, releases some sort of you know, reaction in our brains, and that to kind of think, hang on a minute, how dare you do that? Well, no, it's not what I thought. And it's, you know, those elements that we used to love, you know, back in the early days of Alfred Hitchcock and all those sorts of different ways, you've really taken it further and you've really explored that. And I love it. It's just sort of, you know, and even the notion of, you know, the wording, you know, like I think I mentioned to you before about holding that pistol, you know, and I have this image of, you know, long fingers, you know, with red polished nail polish, you know, there's this femme fatale dressed in black with long hair and deep eyes, and, you know, but really, you know, is it a femme fatale, or is it, you know, even playing with genders, you know, you almost go into that. That's what I love about your work, is that you really kind of can embed through that your sense of reality and live through your characters. So when the picture, I've got to talk, if you can hold your book again, what was the thinking? That picture, because I looked at that and I kept thinking, and it's something about that picture that resonates with me. What got that idea? Where did it come from? Without giving too much away, because I want people to get what I feel like. I kept looking at it and I'm drawn to it. Is that what you wanted us to do? To be drawn to that image?
Absolutely. I want you to be drawn to it. I mean, it's a wonderful photo by Alex Vaughan, and she's a really talented photographer, and we did this photo shoot, and it sort of came out of a collaboration. We'd done a portrait session, which includes the laughing photo from the book, and she was like, well, you've got this whole physical dance, physical theater, you know, background, let's do some stuff. And I had done some wonderful photo shoots in New York with great photographers and just played and stuff, so we just started playing, and I had a feeling this was like the image of the person. What I felt, I guess, you know, in New York at that time, was just my personality being pummeled into 1,000 pieces, you know, turned upside down, squished and twisted up, you know. So I just think it just resonated with all that. And I have to say, you know, there's a little resonance to that wonderful cover from David Bowie in the Lodger album, which is sort of similar.
Yes, one of my favorite artists. I love that.
Yeah, so
I love it. And I'm going to have to ask you, had you also, as part of your book tour, have you thought about creating, or have you created a movement piece to go alongside the book launch?
Not yet, because, you know, we're going to have this online book launch this Sunday.
Which I'm excited, everybody. Please, we've got a link. You've got to come.
Please come. It's going to be great. We've got David Adie's doing the launch. He's really talented and very excited about it. Seems to be very liberated by the potential to lie. He's like, oh my God, I got a whole new kind of writing. I can lie. So that's kind of going to be fun, I think. We did have various plans for launches, but they've all been COVIDized, so we're going to have to see. But yeah, look, I'm hoping we might be able to have some physical launches, but maybe not till next year. So, it's going to be, because no point in having a small launch. You want to have a big party.
Absolutely.
So I think, thinking about how to be super creative with a launch and, as you say, have a bit of performance event, make it a real thing. That's what I'd like to do. Yeah.
I love it. And I would say to everybody listening to this, get yourself a copy, or buy a virtual copy, because I have this fabulous idea that if everyone was to read it a few times, get into it, the characters, so they, when you have this physical launch, it's like reliving, and then we can see what you come up with, Yeah. It's almost like the David Bowie, when we're thinking about one pathway, and then all of a sudden Ziggy just is going to go, and we thought the world was going to end.
Yeah, that's right. No,
I'm a big David Bowie fan. I thought, no, and I was like, and I'm thinking, but it's part of that creative, that reincarnation of morphing into new ideas, and I love that, and I love it about this style, and I'm really excited by this publication, because I feel it's perhaps a new way forward, or that falling in love with genres that really play on different things. And the fact that you have such many creative aspects in dance, and I love the idea of meshing in different elements, having dance and playing on smells and all sorts of things coming together that really can shape our senses.
Yeah,
we don't just read with our minds. We read with our, sounds. We read with our smells. We read with all sorts of things. So I'm really excited that you can see, because I just think it's just fabulous. In terms of taking this to, through different mediums, if you were going to have it as a movie, how would you kind of frame that? Have you thought
look, I think that's the $630 million question.
Oh, okay.
I mean, the challenge is, do you make it a film, a kind of Godardian direct address film where the person is talking to the camera all the time? And that's what I definitely thought. But then you think, oh my God, there's just so many words in there. Is that gonna, even if you're very clever with montages and backdrops, that could be too much? Or maybe you make it more like you watch it like a film noir, and the characters are doing things, or some mix. So I don't have the answer to that, but I have been playing and struggling and thinking with that. My guess is it would have some level of Fleabag like reflexivity, but maybe not entirely that, because I think you'd probably want more layers, and you'd want chances for the audience to get engaged, not feel like they're just kind of in an ironic thing. You want them to have that sort of rush of like, oh my God, I'm so involved, and then play with it. So yeah, I really love to do that. I think it's a big challenge, and hopefully I'll get a chance to do that at some point.
And I think it's one of those projects that really will have a life of its own, because there's so much scope to really bring all your ideas of different forms of performance into it, and having even a piece of a dance piece, all through the elements of music and sound to kind of navigate people, and that idea of you think something's going to happen, and then all of a sudden it just turns itself on its back, and then you're left to think, what just, did I miss something? What's going on? And that almost like being there, almost like making love, and then all of a sudden, it's not, this isn't what I expected, but I still want it, and that's how I imagine this to transform itself into a film, that it is that teasing aspect of wanting to know, and needing some form of what's the word for it, conclusion or some sort of
Closure.
closure, or that explosion of ecstasy, may or may not come into fruition at the end. But that's the whole beauty of it. That's the whole thing of it, to experience something really different that really does tap into that, which is so exciting and so new. So I think, it's an exciting event, and I can't wait for Sunday with the launch. And I'm hoping everybody, and I guess for people to want to get to know you as well, what would you recommend? And I know it's hard because all your publications and are perhaps like babies to you. Is there anything that you've written that's close to More Lies that someone could perhaps read or purchase alongside that if they wanted to get to know you as a writer?
Look, I think what I'd probably say is the last poetry book I wrote, which is probably the easiest one to get, the short story of You and I with UWAP. That's kind of like the opposite of More Lies, because it's interestingly, it's dedicated for you, for the reader. But I think they kind of work together in an interesting way, because it's also, brings into the work the reader, it draws them in, but in a very intimate, warm, kind of supportive, loving kind of way. Whereas in More Lies, it's much more slap, and kind of, but loving in a different way, a little bit more playful. So I think that that in a way, rather than saying that's like it, I'd say it's like it, but also so different, that would be a fun work to compare, because it's much more loving and caring and thoughtful, and whereas More Lies is sassy and in your face and take it or leave it, and it's just a different, and it's still very nice, but kind of a different energy. Look, there's so many different books. I think those two are just easy to get if people want to get them, because they're both easily accessible. The previous book I wrote before that, Fixing the Broken Nightingale, is very kind of a interesting. We talked about Keats before, because it's kind of like a rebirth of romanticism. So I'm very fond of that book. It's got this beautiful painting on the cover by my sister-in-law, Michelle Hiscock, of this person looking into nature. And it's kind of like, and then there's a portrait of me on the back looking at that person. It's kind of like an invitation to introspection, an invitation to reconnect to our deeper selves and to nature. And I think that's a really beautiful book too, but couldn't be further from More Lies. And I guess one other thing I could just mention, since it's pretty easily accessible now, is we make a lot of films. A lot of them were dance films. The most recent film that is easily accessible is the feature film Bloodshot Heart, which is a psychological thriller. And that film, which I have a moustache, I'm the lead actor, that is it's currently available on the Ritz at home, Lido at home, Cameo at home, and Classic at home. So those are all online streaming platforms. It'll probably go on to others over time, but at the moment it's available there for not much money. So you can just download and watch it.
Absolutely. And I would recommend people do that. It's something that, support your artist. If people like asking, what can I do to help? Obviously, I'm going to say buy the book. That goes without saying. But also with the films and stuff. And I'm hoping that we can have you back again, Rich, to talk more about your films and explore that, because I feel you have so much to offer in your rich tapestry of work that really will sort of inspire other people to really go into a space. We're kind of moving now in a new era, post-COVID, whatever you want to call it, and we need to find ways to kind of escape but create a new sense of way of seeing the world. And I love your play of words, your love of language. I can't speak highly enough. Just reading the blurb that I'm excited to read, and I hope that when we next, which we will, I'm sure we'll meet soon, that when we can have that. And I'd love to even have, for everyone's interest as an audience, having a couple of people who also have read it, we can have like a panel discussion.
Oh, that'd be great.
Talk with you, talk about what we felt you know, what we loved, what we found frustrating. And so you get that real hands-on experience of an audience talking with the creator to get that sense. And I'm not going to ask you what you're doing next because I want to keep people captivated for the next session when we meet with you to see that. But I really want to celebrate and really kind of sit with More Lies as we approach Sunday. We'll put all the details on the board. But can you just quickly mention to people listening again, how do they get a hold? Well, I'll put the link, but
yeah. So basically, we'll have a link, but you need to register with Eventbrite. The More Lies book launch is on Sunday, the 10th of October at 5 o'clock Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra time, 4 in Brisbane. Different appropriate times, 4:30 in Adelaide, I think 2 in Western Australia. So but you have to register through Eventbrite and then you're sent the link. And I would suggest people do it soon because I know there's quite a few people coming.
Be fabulous. And you get to see and hear Dr. Richard James Allen speak. and be in an atmosphere where we really maybe hear some things that we haven't heard today, which might be revealed on that day. So you've got to keep the juices flowing, so to speak. Oh, I have to say again, Dr. Richard James Allen, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you, and we look forward to many other seminars with you, because I think what you have shown us is just, it's given me an inspiring re-love again of words and the power of poetry. Poetry isn't something that's dead, or it never has been. But for young people listening in high school, you know, please do read some of Richard's work to get that inspired. Get your teachers to read it and consider putting on plays, or, you know, and then contacting Richard through his multimedia channels. Talk about that work. Tell him what you're thinking about it, because I'm sure you'd love to hear through the young eyes coming through new generations, you know, ideas about the work. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for appearing.
Thank you so much for having me. A great pleasure. Look forward to next time. Bye. Bye, everyone.